Hi, everybody. I'm Jayatri Das, Chief Bioscientist at the Franklin Institute. Thanks for joining me again for one of our conversations about the science behind the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. This week, the news has been all about the decisions that are being made at different levels on how and when we might start to reopen our businesses, our schools, things like that, potentially trying to predict the path of how this pandemic will change and what that means on how our social behavior can change along with it. But there's a lot of uncertainty around that. There are a lot of decisions that we have to make based on incomplete information. So I'm thrilled today to be joined by an expert on somebody who studies exactly how we do that. Annie Duke is a decision strategist who's combined her academic background in cognitive psychology with some real-world experience at the poker table. She's a world champion of poker. And she's especially dedicated to empowering middle and high school students on developing strategies to make better choices and think more critically. So we're thrilled to have her here today. Please feel free to type your questions in. We have some starting questions that we're gonna tackle first, but we'd love to hear what you're thinking about and what questions you have. So go ahead and put those in the comments and we'll tackle them as they come through. So Annie, your expertise is particularly relevant to us right now because we're at this juncture where we're having to face some major decisions that we're to make about the future. And so I wanted to start out with some general concepts in psychology about the idea of cognitive bias. We know that our brains tend to use shortcuts to make sense of information, especially when that information is complicated or conflicting, which is exactly what we're facing right now. So can you start out by explaining to us some different examples of cognitive bias and how it affects our decision-making in general?
Yeah, I can. So I'll try to keep it related to COVID maybe, because one of the things that I think is really true is that we have something called illusion of control, which means that we think that we have more control over the future than we actually do. There's also something called status quo bias, which means that we think that whatever the conditions of the world are today are much more likely to be the conditions of the world tomorrow than they actually are. And all of those have to do kind of with how well do our brains kind of deal with uncertainty. The other thing that we think as decision makers is that when information comes in, that we think about the information objectively in some way, and then we process it, and then that allows us to sort of update our beliefs. But it's actually not, it doesn't work exactly that way. Basically what happens is that we have things that we kind of want to believe or that we already believe, and that when information comes in, we'll tend to process it in the same way in order to support the belief we have. This is generally called a pattern called motivated reasoning. So all of these actually really apply to kind of what's happening with the COVID crisis. If I take just the last one, the motivated reasoning piece, you can see, for example, a very big difference in the way that Republicans and Democrats are in general thinking about it, what their kind of alarms about it were, how optimistic or pessimistic they might be about opening the doors to the country. And this isn't, obviously, I'm not talking about every Democrat or every Republican, but you can sort of generally see these patterns. And that's because there's a political point of view that goes along with it. And political views in particular are very strongly held beliefs where people can have the exact same information about COVID and come to very different conclusions about things like when would we be able to safely go out.
Right. And we see this type of political bias in all sorts of scientific issues and people's opinions towards them as well. So we're just seeing another manifestation of that here as we're thinking about COVID.
Right, that's true. And it's not, I do want to say it's not a one-sided problem. So for example, if you're on the left, you may be more likely, people on the left are more likely to be anti-vax. Right. People on the left are also more likely to be anti-nuclear and not really look at the data around that. Whereas people on the right, for example, are more likely to deny climate change, just like in climate science as an example. So you can actually see that this is pretty egalitarian. We notice the places where the people on the other side of the aisle are ignoring the science that we like, but we don't notice the places where we might be ignoring the science that we don't personally like. And so this kind of crosses everybody.
Right, and we see that in communication in terms of how do you cut through where someone's preconceptions are based on their values and their identity, and how do you try and expose them to considering an alternative point of view.
Right, and I think that, you know, what's interesting is that I think that one thing that the coronavirus really kind of brings to the fore is that there are real world consequences to kind of not paying attention, right? To not noticing. So, you know, if you think about, for example, the signals that were being sent from Italy, right? What we were seeing in China, what we were seeing in terms of what the spread of the disease was, how dangerous it was, what the fatality rate was, and things like that. People were processing that information very differently. And we can see what the real world consequences of processing that information differently are. So we can see, for example, the way that South Korea chose to handle it versus the way that, say, America chose to handle it, and that realizes an actual real world consequences.
Right. So now we're starting to connect that just information processing to that next step of having to make a decision based on that information.
Right.
And you've framed that process and thinking about how to make smarter decisions as this idea of what you call thinking in bets. Can you explain what you mean with that framing?
Sure. So basically a bet is just, I'm in a situation that's uncertain, meaning that it's uncertain in two ways. There's luck involved, so that the way that the world could turn out, it could turn out in many different ways. Like if I flip a coin, it could be heads, it could be tails. That will happen 50% of the time. So that if I bet on one, I'm not guaranteed to make it, even if you're offering me a very good proposition. So let's say that you were offering me $10 if I called it correctly, and I only had to pay you $1 if I didn't. That would be a really big money-making proposition. It would be mathematically good for me to do that. But that doesn't mean that I can guarantee that I'm going to actually win. I could actually end up owing you the dollar if we did that once, right? So that's kind of the luck element. But then there's another source of uncertainty, which is hidden information, just stuff we don't know. And obviously, we can really, really see that with coronavirus. Like, what's the rate of asymptomatic cases? We don't really know. What's the R naught, the rate of transmission under different circumstances, right? We not really sure. Is it changing? Is it mutating? You know, so on and so forth. So we can think about, there's lots and lots of inputs that we just are very unclear. But while that's really in your face for coronavirus, that happens to be true of every single decision that you ever make. Like, even if you're just trying to choose the route to work, you just don't know if there's an accident on the road always or not. That's something that you may not know. You may not know that, like, there's somebody on the road who is impaired and they're driving, or there's a whole bunch of stuff that can kind of get in the way, even for everyday simple decisions that are amplified by coronavirus. So when we think about what does it mean to bet, what it means is that we have different options we can choose from. Those options are going to cost us different resources, like time or money or happiness or health or whatever it is. And so given the resources that we have for any given option we're choosing, we're trying to figure out which option is going to turn out in the best future more of the time for us. So if I take route A or route B to work, which one's going to kind of work out the best for me? And I'm always making a bet on that because I can't guarantee the outcome. And you can think about that in the decision making around, you know, coronavirus. Like, you have to make a bet on when and do you lock down. As an example, there's clearly a cost to that. You're expending resources in order to do that. And you're thinking about what's going to get you the best return in terms of getting through the pandemic. And at what point would it make sense to do that? So that's a very classic within the sense of betting.
Right, and so in one of our previous conversations on one of our Facebook Lives, we've talked about models from an epidemiological point of view, talking about how you might predict the disease to spread given different circumstances. But what we're looking at now is a different scale of modeling, that now we're taking in all of these social factors into account. And, you know, what you were describing in terms of predicting, you know, knowns and unknowns, that's essentially what modeling is, right?
Yeah, so that's it. That's exactly what modeling is. So what we can think about is this, that let me just put out the premise that every decision you ever make is a prediction about the future. So you're always doing these forecasts, which means that you as a human being are always creating models. You have a model of the way the world works. You have the model of the way that traffic works in your area, so on and so forth, right? So you can kind of think about that. And so what we're sort of trying to figure out is, given the models, they're going to tell you different possible futures that can occur. So it's going to be very rare that you have a model that tells you this will for sure occur. There are assumptions based on what do we know. And then given what we know, we're doing our best, kind of our best educated guess, which is not a bad thing, because that's what all decision making is, our best educated guess on how we're supposed to think about what the consequences downstream of the different inputs that we're thinking about are. And then what are the different worlds that we can imagine this model predicting depending on what human behavior is. And so that's really what you're trying to figure out, is given the range of possible futures and what the model is telling you in this moment, how can I think about what the best decision across all those different possibilities that the future might hold for me is. And then the key is that a good model is fluid. Mm-hmm. So as new information comes in, the model is going to output different responses. So that's where you can get something like a model could predict, say by August, I predict that there's going to be 500,000 deaths, but then everybody hides in their house and then they downgrade it to 100,000 deaths. That doesn't mean that the model was wrong. It means that something changed about the inputs into the model. If we found out that there was something different about how many people are asymptomatic, for example, or the spread within the population today, that would be a new input that would go into the model, and then the model would output a different set of possibilities in terms of the future. So you're just trying to make the best decision across all of those.
So I have a question from somebody who's watching, who is interested in thinking about how our emotions then interact with this type of information. So we're seeing people on social media say that, we can't live in fear. What does that mean? How does that type of emotional reaction interface with this type of logical approach to decision making?
Yeah, so emotions interact almost always poorly with decisions. Well, because you're not recruiting the parts of your brain that can allow you to think logically. So there's an area of your brain called the amygdala, and that's really where kind of emotion and fear lives. It's essentially, you can think about your amygdala as kind of an attention getter, and the thing that gets your amygdala's attention is scary stuff. And when that part of your brain is lit up, because there's scary stuff, like you could think about back in the day, it would be like a lion approaching, right? So that's gonna get your amygdala going. That then basically you get into these like flight or fight responses, and you're not really sort of thinking things through in terms of what's the best response. So what emotionally might feel like the best decision to make right now, very often, if you think about it in terms of, well, what's the long run response to that, it's usually pretty bad. I can give you like a specific example of the way that emotions can kind of get in the way of decision making, particularly as it kind of relates to this. So one of the things that's true about us as decision makers is that we don't like to do painful things. It's unpleasant, but we do like to do really fun things. So you can think about it like as an example, like if you hire an employee and it turns out that there's some signs that they might not have been a good hire, and they're kind of not a good cultural fit, and you have to have like an unpleasant conversation with them. Generally, you'll delay that in order to avoid having to experience the pain of having an uncomfortable conversation with them. But by the time you do that, it's usually kind of too late, right? But on the flip side, if it's September and my boss gives me some idea that I might be getting a good bonus in December, I'll go and I'll borrow against the bonus, basically. Like maybe I'll buy myself a fancy car. Of course, there's a lot of stuff that can happen between September and December, but I want to bank that good feeling. So this is like, we really want the high that comes from the good thing, and we'll exercise those things early. We'll do them too early, and the things that are painful we'll do too late. So how does that relate to COVID? Well, I've been sitting here saying, well, here's this strange thing that happened. Like, we kind of watched what happened in China, and it seems pretty clear that like they allowed the epidemic to get pretty widespread before they decided to shut down. And then we watched what happened in Italy, and it was like, they waited till they had hundreds of cases before they decided to shut down. And then we saw what happened in France. It was the same thing. They seem to have waited a long time before they shut down. And then the same thing in Spain, and so on and so forth. And then we saw that happen in New York. And then New York was kind of like the canary in the coal mine for America. But yet you still see like Florida was really late to shutting down, and they actually had thousands of cases before they shut down, despite the fact that you could see what was happening to the medical system in a place like New York pretty clearly. So as you kind of go through, some worse than others, most people are locking down late. Why? Because it's painful. It doesn't feel good. It's actually a form of emotional decision making, that you want to be in a situation where you're so sure and you're so certain that you've got to do this painful thing, that you actually kind of wait till it's too late, which is particularly true when you have something that grows exponentially, right? Because otherwise it's kind of a head scratcher, right? It's like everybody saw that Italy shut down. Like, wouldn't you want to avoid, I don't know what percentage of their healthcare workers ended up getting infected, but you saw this wartime triage happening, and refrigerated trucks outside the hospitals, and just all this. And you say, well, there's an easy way to avoid that, except you can see repeatedly that we're not avoiding that. And it's actually because of emotions.
And I think, an extension of that then for diseases as well is that when you do take the action early enough, it's, it has that negative consequence of people saying that you probably overreacted.
Yeah. So what did somebody said, it's the preparedness paradox. I think I heard somebody call it that. I think that's what it's called, is the preparedness paradox, right? So here's this really interesting thing. I can actually frame it in terms of fire insurance. So if you think about fire insurance on your house, right? It costs you something. You got to pay for the fire insurance. You buy the house, right? Why do you have the fire insurance? Well, because in case your house burns down, you really don't want to have to pay for a new house. That would be financially devastated. But here's the really interesting thing. Do you ever want to have to use that insurance?
Yes.
No. You don't want your house to burn down. So you're paying for this thing, you're buying this thing called fire insurance for a house because you don't want it to burn down, but you actually never ever want to use it. And what's interesting about those kinds of things, so they're just called hedges. It's like mitigating the sort of the impact of bad things happening. Like when bad luck happens, it mitigates that, or when you make terrible decisions, it can mitigate that. Is that when the world looks like you didn't need it, you're sad that you've got it. So like when your house never burns down, you're like, man, why did I ever have that?
I wasted all that money.
I wasted all of that money. That's so ridiculous, right? So you could think about that, for example, let's say that we had spent all of February, like the United States, spending money on tons and tons and tons and tons of tests and building up testing capacity, right? There was some possibility in February we would never, ever have to use it. And then everybody would be pointing fingers saying, that was dumb. Why did we spend all that money on tests? So that's similar to insurance.
So we've got a couple questions here that I want to talk about. First is, as we're thinking about making these decisions on an individual basis, we have a question about how an individual assessment of your personal health risk versus your economic risk affects your judgment and decision making.
Yeah, so I think that, these are where things become very much about what your own needs and values are. So the fact is that every single day that we choose to go to work, we're taking on risk, right? Because we all know that cars are actually very dangerous, for example. And individuals who get in their car every day to drive to work under normal circumstances have decided that whatever the risk is to them of being in a car every day is worthwhile. It's worthwhile to take that risk on in order to go to work and be productive and so on and so forth. And in simple ways, we make those kinds of decisions every day. Like we all know that like a piece of cake and ice cream is going to shorten our lives a tiny little bit, right? So there's some risk that's coming to us from that, but maybe in the moment we decide that the enjoyment from that is worthwhile to us, in order for us to be willing to take on that risk. So these become personal decisions about, first of all, what your need is, what your economic need is, and also what the risk to your health is and how much you're willing to risk your health in order to satisfy the economic need. Because if we were to say that we had to live a zero risk life, then nobody would ever get in a car to go to work, right? Because then you would really reduce your risk to zero. So this is something that every single person on their own kind of needs to decide. That's an equation that needs to be decided for themselves. Now, obviously, in this particular case, it's a little bit complicated. Right. Because if I choose to eat birthday cake, I'm kind of only affecting me. Right. But in this case, you have to think about what risk am I putting at other people at, and what are sort of the societal risks? Because if society doesn't do well, then, and I'm contributing that, then that's going to affect my economics in the future. And then the other thing with this is that there's a toggle on your own health risk, depending on whether the hospitals are overwhelmed. So it's a little bit in your best interest to make sure that the hospitals don't become overwhelmed, which then aligns with it's in your best interest to not be infecting people who are at high risk. So this becomes very, very complicated decision-making that people have to sort of think through for themselves. And in some cases, I think kind of listen to the public policy experts or the epidemiologists to sort of understand what your own situation is.
But sometimes that again conflicts with the values that are part of your personal identity and the societal norms that you live in. And
yes,
this is what's leading to some of these, small scale protests that we're seeing, where people feel like their individual assessment of risk is in conflict with what's being imposed.
Right. Right. Although I do think that if people, I have one of my feelings is that because, so I'm all about, if you individually think that it's not, that you're willing to take on the risk of getting sick, you go do that, right? but the issue is that you may be really having a deep effect on other people's risk because of the hospital situation. Right. So I suppose if you're going to go put yourself at risk, then if you get sick, don't go to a hospital. Yeah. And that would solve the problem. I don't know. I don't know, but the point is that obviously these are very complicated because your risk isn't your own, right? In this particular case, exactly. we have an issue of communal problems, right? So it's kind of similar to the drunk driving, right? The reason we have drunk driving laws is because you're not just putting yourself at risk. If it were the case that if you were to drunk drive and you made the decision that whatever you had decided that you were willing to take that risk on and you didn't have any effect on anybody else, I'd be like, I don't agree and I'd like to educate you otherwise, but you be you. But the problem is if you get in a car and you're drunk driving, you're actually putting everybody on the road with you at risk. And so we have that in the equation as well.
So another question is that, as we're putting together these types of models about, how the virus might spread throughout society, we have a question that, until we get a vaccine, isn't there a strong possibility that a strong majority of people will get the coronavirus?
So there is actually a very strong possibility that a majority of people will get the coronavirus. So that's actually where the models are incredibly helpful. Because the interesting thing about this particular virus is that we have control over the death rate, some control over the death rate. So ideally what you would want to do in terms of the fatality rate is to keep it as whatever the lowest possibility is. So there's a couple of ways we can do that, but one of them is by making sure that the number of people who are sick at any given time is enough that hospitals have enough ventilators and enough treatment and can attend to anybody who comes in a way where they can be helpful. Because what we've seen from Italy is that when the hospitals get overwhelmed, the fatality rate really, really shoots up because you can't actually treat people who would otherwise survive. And so that's one way to do it, is essentially you could think about it as slow the spread, because stop the spread is probably impossible, and keep it below what the hospitals can bear. Now,
and we've heard this term, flattening the curve. That
right, exactly.
We're not necessarily, trying to reduce the total number of people who are infected in the long run. We're just trying to slow it over a longer time.
Right. So that's the first thing. It's like slow it, keep the hospitals under capacity. But the other thing is that word slow, because what we know about human ingenuity is that time is incredibly valuable. Buying time in this case is really, really, really important, because every day that is a day that you're not sick, is a day that they may come up with a treatment that makes it so that if you do get it prior to a vaccine being introduced, that you'll actually be able to get through the virus fine. So part of the other thing is that we just want to buy time for that reason. So yeah, probably it's going to be the case that before the vaccine ever gets out, it's going to be likely that a very high percentage of the population has it. But what you'd like to do is that as they're getting it, that they have access to a hospital, and then over time, they should have access to better and better treatment.
So another question as we start to look at the big picture, what tools do you recommend that we can use either at the individual level or at the societal level to make smarter decisions more logically rather than emotionally when there is so much uncertainty out there?
Yeah, so that is such a great question. Thank you so much for whoever asked that. That's like my favorite question to ever get asked. So a lot of the problems that we have when we're making decisions, particularly emotionally, is that we're making decisions in the moment where we're trying to solve the problem that's like right there. And mostly what can happen is that after we're sort of on the back end of it, we realize that whatever the emotional decision that we made, maybe if we had time to think about it, it wasn't like the best decision, right? So you can think about it as the number of times that you do something and then 2 weeks later you're like, what? Here's a simple one. Like you're really angry and you type out that like really bad email and you're just mad and you hit send, right? Well, I mean, obviously like the next day you're like, why didn't I just take a second, put it in the draft box, take a moment and not send it, and then think about it, because by the next day you usually regret it and you wish that you had gone back and done this and rewritten it, or maybe not sent it at all, or kept it to yourself or whatever, or handled it in a totally different way. So we can think about this in terms of the decisions around COVID, is that you should be doing a lot of mental time travel. And you can do this in little ways. Like when you're about to react in a way that you think might be impulsive, you can just stop yourself and say, if I imagine it's a week from now, do I think I'm going to be happy that I made this decision? Right. So so that can be helpful in terms of just sort of planning. Like if you're thinking about the economy, right, you can say, is this going to be like, once COVID is gone, is it going to be a really quick recovery? Is it going to be more of a recession? Is it going to be more of a depression? You can get ahead of that. And instead of deciding it's one thing or the other, you can be a good modeler and you can say, well, let me imagine, like if it were a V-shaped recovery, what are the things that I could have done that would have made it better for me? Like how could I have participated in that better? If it's a more of like what's called a U-shaped recovery or recession, and you're thinking about your own business, you can say, okay, it's 6 months from now and we're in a recession. What are the decisions I wish I had made today when I'm actually thinking about them? So what that allows you to do is it allows you to kind of get out in front and engage the prefrontal cortex, which is the place where your more rational decision making occurs. And it allows you to start to sort of get ahead of your decisions so that you can be planning much farther in advance, which is usually a better thing to do. It also allows you to create kind of a list of signposts in the world that would tell you that different things are happening or not. And generally, it gives you that stop and think moment that can stop you from that emotional decision, like even in a micro way. So you can be thinking like in a macro way, like what does the economic recovery look like? But you can think about it in a micro way, like before you send that email, just stop and say, let me think, it's a week from now. Do I regret sending this or am I happy I sent it? And that will generally short circuit a little bit of that emotional response.
So as we're thinking about that, part of it is being able to evaluate information as it's coming in. And right now it feels like there's just so much information that's out there. What are some strategies to maybe assign some hierarchy to the value of different types of information?
Yeah, so there's a few things. One is that right now, for any information that comes in, you should be holding that pretty loosely, very far in between true or false. And that's not the way that we generally think about something. So if you take something like hydroxychloroquine, right?
Mm-hmm.
As an example, there was a period where people were like, this is the cure. Right. And when people are speaking in a time of great uncertainty, that something is for sure going to work, that's a good time to discount. And even if you have particularly right now, we're going to be very susceptible to that kind of talk because we want that to be the cure. And it may well turn out that it's helpful. Given new information that's come in recently, it looks like a not so great a candidate anymore. But even at the time when maybe there were some good signs out in the world that was going to be a good cure, just always try to hold that very loosely and say, I don't think about that as good or bad or true or false, as something that's a possibility and you're going to do a lot better. So, and you should be doing that with everything. When someone tells you they know for sure what the asymptomatic transmission rate is, or they know for sure what the fatality rate is, or things like that, there's going to be so much information coming in that you should say, oh, that's interesting, and I'll hold that as a data point, but I need to see a lot more. That's number one.
We've talked in some previous conversations about how systematic design to test the reliability of information. So for instance, when it comes to drugs, like the clinical trials process is a way to help us check.
Right, exactly, because the problem is, particularly when you're dealing with something that has a relatively low fatality rate, right? No matter what, no matter how we think about it, it's not like 100 people get it, 100 people die. So if there were a disease where 100 people got it and those 100 people would die, if I had a drug and I just gave it to all the people who had it and I found out that some of them didn't die, that would actually be really good information. But in a case where you might have 20 patients come in and you give them the drug and one of them dies, that might have been what the result was no matter what. Right. So it becomes much harder to navigate when you have a smaller number of people who would have had that happen to them in the first place, right? So we need to be approaching that with sort of skeptical optimism, right? In the sense that, oh, that's really optimistic news and it gives me hope, but I need to also realize that I can't think about that information as true or false. That's number one. Right. Number two is you have to know what the source is. There's a lot of armchair epidemiologists right now out there who might know things that are adjacent, like they might be data scientists, right? But epidemiological models are something that's very specific. And when you listen to the really expert epidemiologists, even somebody like Dr. Fauci, right? Mm-hmm. What he's saying is, I can't give you a date that we're going to open the country because the disease is going to tell us that. That when somebody is speaking that way, that's a good signal that they should be listened to. He's an expert in the field, and he is not giving you yes or no definitive answers in an environment that's incredibly uncertain, where there's a lot of luck involved, a lot of hidden information, and there's new information coming in every single day. He's saying, we're going to have to wait because the world's going to kind of tell us this. And that's a really good signal. So basically, particularly when there's a lot of uncertainty, one of your best rules of thumb is if someone's telling you something is certain, you should just ignore them.
That's good advice. But you raise a good point here that I thought it's a nice segue to another question that's come in, is that, at a certain point, we're having to make these, decisions about acceptable risk, right? And so we have a question, at what point will people decide that the health risk is acceptable, knowing that whatever that decision is could be a death sentence for 10% of the population?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's something that sort of keeps me up at night.
Right. And 10% is probably way too high. I don't know that we'd get that high, but what is that level and what are we comfortable with?
Yeah, so essentially what I think is true, and I think that you can see this pretty clearly, is that those kinds of things have very bandwagon-y effects. And so I think it depends a little bit how leadership is communicating, right? So is leadership sort of leaning in a way that's communicating toward going out, or is leadership communicating in a way that's going in? So number one, we tend to sort of look for answers in that way. But the other thing is, I think that what you saw was that in certain places, like where I live, one day everybody was out and about, and then the next day it was totally considered a reasonable decision to be in your house. Mm-hmm. And I remember having some conversations with people like 4 days before the lockdown, where they were like, where I was saying, oh, just so you know, like, I'm not going to come to tennis clinic. Well, why not? Well, do you really think it's that bad? Like, that seems like you're overreacting. So like 4 days before, it was like I was overreacting because I wasn't going to tennis clinic. And then a week later, it was like, how could anybody ever go to tennis clinic? So a lot of it has to do with like social proof. So there's some really wonderful studies which show like, if someone's walking along a street and one person looks up, everybody keeps walking. But if 10 people look up, everybody looks up. So this is called social proof. And when we have decisions about this kind of thing, there's a lot of social proof. So there's going to be some tipping point. I'm not sure which it is. And I think it's going to be different for different areas. And I think it's going to be different for different political tribes, what the social proof is before people just decide I'm willing to take on the risk. My thoughts about it is that I don't know when that point is, because would be very complicated to model. But what I do think is that people are going to make that decision, and then 2 weeks later, they're going to run back in their houses. That's the one thing that I think is a very likely outcome right now.
Right. So someone's talking about a Stanford study about antibody testing that's come out, and I haven't clicked over to the link yet to confirm which study exactly this is referring to. Are you familiar with this? It's a study of...
Yeah, this is for Santa Clara.
For Santa Clara, yes. Okay, yes.
Yeah, so I would really recommend that people look for some critiques of that study, because there are some very good ones. Again, this is one of those things where it's like skeptical hope.
Yeah,
would be very helpful. So basically what they were saying is that the rate of the number of people, they were estimating that the rate of number of people who actually have the disease is quite high. And what they were estimating was, it was something like, and I'm go look this up because you should double check me on this. Yes. I'm doing it literally off the top of my head. It's something like, it's like 50 to 80 times the confirmed cases. So there's a few problems with that study. And I think this is a good lesson in sort of skeptical optimism, right? Because obviously it would be really optimistic if that were the case. And
as I'm looking at this, I think I've read some of the criticism, and part of the things to look at is, again, the strategy by which the study was designed, how you recruit participants for the study, and whether you are inherently biasing the sample that's in the study based on the strategies that you use to get people involved.
Right, so that's kind of problem number one. Problem number two is that there's an interaction between the amount of testing you're doing and what that multiple should be. So you can imagine, like, let's say that I ran the study in a place where I only did one test. And now I find out that 50 people have the disease. Now I come up with a multiple of, well, you should multiply the confirmed test by 50. But that's a limitation of the testing, where if you did that in a place that like New York, for example, which has done many, many more tests, multiplying by 50 wouldn't make sense anymore. So there were some issues there in terms of the multipliers. There were some issues in terms of what their assumptions were about some of the transmission rates and so on and so forth. So again, the best place to go look for what percentage of the population is likely to have it is to look at places, get your reference class right, basically, to look at places where they've tested everybody, and then also try to look at places that are likely to have the density and the interaction and sort of shut down in a similar time frame as you did. That would be kind of a good way to think about it. But I mean, there's hope in that study. It's just that, again, it's kind of preliminary. There were problems. They recruited off Facebook, so they were likely to be getting people who were suspicious that they had it, which then obviously would really increase the rates of transmission. So when you look at those studies, there's some places that are extrapolating like 1 or 2% of the population has had it. And there's other places who are extrapolating 50% of the population who's had it. So what that means is that just take that all with a grain of salt, because when it's so wide, what you know is like, we really don't know very much about it.
Right. And I think that is, advice that applies to the whole situation here, is that, in an ideal world, we collect more and more information until we have a level of confidence that, that we're willing to make that bet. Right. But we're faced with a crisis in which people are dying if we don't make decisions sooner.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of people who have the instinct, particularly people who are communicating in politics, who have the instinct that if they could say what's for sure going to happen, that's actually what people want to hear. So as an example, like, I have concerns about the way that the University of Washington model has been used, as if that's telling you the truth. Right? That when they say 60,000 people are going to be infected by August, or are going to have been succumbed to the disease by August 4th, that they're telling you something that is a fact, right? As opposed to a projection, one projection among many, 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 many different models that are out there. And ideally what we want to do is look across all of those models, look at what the assumptions are in the model, how they're doing the model, kind of figure out what the best ones are and come up with a lower bound and an upper bound, right? This is sort of the lowest we expect. This is the highest we expect. And anything within that range we would kind of understand, right? So some of that I think is because people want to, we have the instinct that people want to be told what's true.
Right.
But actually the cognitive science in situations like this, when there are crises, shows that what people would really like is to be told the truth wrapped in a hopeful message. So here's what's true. Here's what we don't know. Here's, you know, all of these hard choices we're going to have to make. This is going to be pretty scary and ugly and heartbreaking, but I have faith and hope and human ingenuity. So that would be like the kind of message that people would tend to respond to the best in this kind of environment.
Right. One last question before we wrap up, and maybe you've heard more about this than I have, but there's a question about why India seems to be reporting so few deaths and COVID-19 cases. Are there different paths of information being released?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that you always want to ask about when you're looking at different fatality rates and different confirmed cases and things like that is you always want to ask the basics. So the answer about India is I don't know the basics. How many tests are they doing? What is their testing capacity? How are they deciding if somebody has died of COVID or not? Because one way that you can get to a very low death rate or number of deaths in your country due to COVID is that you just haven't tested anybody. So we know that that's true of Africa, for example. So they're not showing a lot of COVID cases, but it's literally because they don't have the testing capacity. I think that I had read something about India, and I'm not certain of this, but I think I had read something that they also have testing capacity issues. And so in that case, you need to understand that basic fact, because you can imagine, like, if you take it to the extreme, we could be reporting 0 cases in this country. Right. If we had tested 0 people, our reported cases would be 0. And then maybe people would be looking at our country and saying, why is America doing so well? They seem to have 0 cases. That's really amazing. So that's one thing that you want to look at too, is how are you kind of deciding what's a COVID death and what's not a COVID death. And then you have this issue, and I'm sure that this is true, particularly in places that have a high poverty rate, that you're going to have this death at home issue, where we may not actually know until we can understand the variance between, there was actually there was some great statistical work done in the affected areas of Italy and in the Lombardy area, where they looked at, if you looked at 2015 through 2019, and you said what were the average number of deaths during March of those years, and you averaged that out for those 4 years, and then you looked at what were the deaths this March in that area, and then how many of those were attributed to COVID. Well, the COVID was only accounting for about 1/3 of that difference, and the difference was actually quite large. So sometimes we're only going to be able to see it that way just because of issues of recording. So
Right.
Until you know the facts, what's the testing rate, how are they recording deaths, are people dying at home or in hospitals, like there's all these questions that you need to know before you can really say, why is India doing so much better than us?
Yeah. So as we move forward, it sounds like, the advice that you're giving us to think about on an individual level is to have that skeptical optimism,
right,
about the information that we're hearing and what we might predict, for our own lives in the coming months.
Yeah, and I would say the thing that I would say is be the most skeptical when the piece of information is aligning with something that you would like to be true. Right. Because if you want it to be true, that is when you are going to be the most susceptible to not questioning the information that comes in. And that's when you really need to be hyper vigilant. And, obviously we would want it to be true that somehow India is not being affected, because that would give us hope, because we could go find out and we could say, why is nobody dying in India? So we're much more likely to view that in that frame because we would like it to be true. And we're much less likely to question it and say, well, let me think about it. Why might that not be what it seems.
Right. And so then if you extrapolate that to policymakers, we hope that they're having that same critical thinking and using that strategy of kind of imagining themselves 2 weeks, 4 weeks, months into the future and thinking, what's the decision that I wish I would have made?
Yeah, and in particular, one of the things that I'm really concerned about in this particular decision making about opening up is that the way that we view information is path dependent. So we don't think about things in isolation. We think about the path that we got to whatever the state of the world is today. So one of my concerns is that, let's say that you live in an area and there were 0 infections, and then a week later there's 100 infections. You're like, hair's on fire, right? Oh my gosh, like this thing is growing in my area. I need to get inside my house at 100 infections. But now let's say that everybody gets in their house and it's now a month later or 2 months later, and the infections had grown from that 100 when you went into your house to 20,000. But now you're on the downward swing and it goes from 20,000 to 1,000 infections. Notice that's 10 times worse than when you went in your house. But because of the path that you took to get there, because you've now been on a decline, you're like, woohoo, 1,000 infections. This is amazing. We've really done something. I'm ready to go outside of my house. But notice that you're doing that at a time when there's 10 times more exposure for you than there was when you went into your house. And that's the thing that probably concerns me the most, is this path dependent. It really matters the path that you got, where you got, how you got there, in terms of the way that you think about whatever the number is. So I always think about it this way, like with gambling, like if you start off, if you were winning $1,000 and then you only win $100 in like blackjack at the casinos, you're like, I'm so sad. But if you were losing $1,000, but then you get all but $100 back, you're like, I'm so happy. So you're sad because you won $100 because you were winning more, but you're sad, you're happy because you lost $100 because you were losing less. And that's one thing that worries me, that on the way up, I think that we're probably going to be more alarmed by much lower numbers. And on the way down, we're going to feel this sense of safety around numbers that are even higher than the ones that caused us to go into our house.
I think that's great food for thought to end on, Annie. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your insight on, everything from just, how our brains and our information processing works to how that actually applies to the crisis at hand. Thanks again, Annie.
Thank you.
We'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.